It was in 2011 when I started working in detention. At that time, there'd been a lot of public and professional criticism of immigration detention. The harms to mental health of prolonged detention were already being documented through the Palmer Inquiry and in reviews by the Australian Human Rights Commission, the Commonwealth Ombudsman, and also in a number of coronial inquiries into deaths in detention. The findings from these propelled a number of reforms within the immigration detention regime, improving the standard of health services and introducing a degree of monitoring and oversight, particularly in the creation of the Independent Detention Health Advisory Group. These changes held out the prospect that it was possible to work within the detention system to reduce harm and for positive change. One of my first experiences of visiting detention centres was at Christmas Island shortly after I started in 2011. The first asylum seeker I saw was a man who the mental health staff were concerned had become severely depressed. When I saw him, he was housed in what was called the visit section at Christmas Island. It was a hot and dirty environment, and more than 50 men were housed there, all sleeping on mattresses on the floor. They had no privacy, and there was one shower and one toilet between the 50 men. He was a survivor of torture and trauma and been in detention for a prolonged period, a much longer period than was necessary for administrative time, for health and identity checks and other checks to be performed. His mental health had been deteriorating, and he had recently received news of other family members who had been killed in a bomb blast back in his home country. When I saw him, he was shaking and he was crying. He said that he could see his dead family in front of him. His speech was quite confused, he made no sense. It was clear from what the staff had told me and what I could see for myself that he was severely traumatised and vulnerable. Like the many people in detention, he had suffered torture and trauma. This had been compounded by suffering the stress of prolonged detention in poor conditions, without meaningful activities to do, with little communication with the outside world, with no capacity for making day-to-day decisions for himself, and with little and conflicting information about his asylum claim from immigration officials, and the prolonged uncertainty associated with this as to its outcome. As a result of these factors, his mental health had been damaged, and combined with a further personal loss he had suffered, he completely lost his sanity at that point. The health staff had done their best to support the man, but counselling, psychological therapy and medications can only do so much. It was obvious that he needed to be treated in a proper hospital environment, and that action needed to be taken to address the issues that had led him to this point. Anywhere else in Australia, the decision to provide this treatment would be a medical matter. He would have been admitted to hospital immediately. However, in immigration detention, I quickly learned that it was a much more complicated matter. It involved the process of briefings, justifications, written advice that had to be escalated up through layers of bureaucracy, while needing to be careful at all times to maintain stakeholder relationships. This was the standard phrase that was meant staying on side with immigration and security staff by leaving out mention of the contributions of his condition from delayed immigration processing and the negative effects of detention itself. I was accustomed to working in public health services, dealing with people in extreme distress and having limited resources to assist, but this was quite different, because here the issue wasn't one of rationing resources. Rather, it was evident that despite the knowledge and advice received from previous research and inquiries, the state in this case was expending resources to cause and prolong mental suffering as part of its policy of mandatory detention. This experience framed the essential challenge of the professional and ethical conflicts of working as a health professional in the immigration detention system. That is, how to carry out a duty of care to do no harm, to be able to empathise and have a therapeutic relationship with asylum seekers, and to fulfil a professional duty to advocate for their interests, while working within and helping to support a system that was grinding them down and progressively destroying their mental health. This situation represents a fundamental conflict of interest for health staff. It demands the ability to continuously operate on two different and incompatible levels, walking a tightrope between professional and ethical responsibilities on the one hand, and avoiding being labelled as soft or worse, an advocate, which could lead to your dismissal. This dilemma was played out every day for every member of the health staff, particularly our frontline mental health clinicians. It made for a stressful workplace with a high level of staff burnout. Some long-stay survivors had developed ways around the system to assist the most badly affected detainees, often by building relationships with more sympathetic security or immigration officials. Others, unfortunately, succumbed to the pressures of the environment by distancing themselves and becoming hardened, including through practices such as calling people by their boat numbers. In my role, I was a point of escalation for staff who were attempting to assist the most badly affected detainees, and I was the point of liaison with the senior decision-making staff in Canberra. This was a point of considerable friction, but which enabled me to get a close view of the processes and politics as they played out over time. Initially, the positive changes that had occurred in detention health policy, especially the support of the DHAG, enabled recruitment of more mental health staff, including nurses, psychologists, and counsellors and psychiatrists. We were able to introduce an outreach model of service to break down the barriers to mental health support and to improve mental health screening processes, identifying people needing more support and treatment. For some individuals, we were able to overcome other departmental barriers to enable faster processing or expedited community placement. But as the months passed, and following the failure of the Malaysian solution, the arrivals continued to increase. The number of people in detention, crowding, and length of detention both continued to escalate. This was a very worrying situation because all of the research and our data showed that when a person's time in detention passes 6 months, their mental health steadily declines and the risk of self-harm and suicide attempts increase correspondingly. It was evident we were approaching a tipping point at which the numbers of people suffering negative mental health effects of detention was going to become unmanageable. Planning what to do was difficult for the Immigration Department because the government's policy was that the boats would stop. And so the plan for greater numbers and length of stay would have been seen as unsupportive of the government. So it placed the Immigration Department officials in a dilemma. So new places were opened, capacity was increased, but as the crisis continued to unfold, a major change in policy occurred. The decision to unblock the processing of asylum claims and introduction of bridging visas. Although this type of temporary visa system has its own problems, at this time it provided a much needed circuit breaker. As people were released on bridging visas, the incidence of mental health problems, self-harm and suicide attempts in detention fell substantially. What was most striking from my perspective was that there was a dramatic change in the atmosphere in the detention centres and the Immigration Department hierarchy itself. Now that people were being treated, or not being treated as prisoners, the immigration and security staff at all levels no longer needed to maintain negative attitudes towards them. And they started to speak about them and treat them as normal human beings. However, this did not apply to one group of detained asylum seekers, those people from Sri Lanka who had been deemed to have adverse security risk and who in some cases had been in detention for many years. Several of this group were also involved in legal challenges to their indefinite detention. The Immigration Department had become convinced that this group of more than 50 individuals each had cyanide capsules that they'd been hiding since they'd been detained. And they'd been secretly planning a coordinated national mass suicide that would occur on the anticipated failure in the High Court of a prominent appeal case. Despite there being no evidence and no historical precedent for such an event anywhere in the world ever, this bizarre idea was firmly believed by people at high levels in the Immigration Department. Despite advice as to the futility of the plan, they insisted that large quantities of cyanide antidote be kept at hand, that staff were specially trained in its use, and that extra staff were placed on duty for the event. The plan did not include notifying New South Wales Ambulance or the local hospitals, and they balked at this suggestion in typical fashion because they wanted it all kept secret. We had to persuade them to agree to let us speak to the ambulance and local hospitals by convincing them of how bad it would look for them if their doomsday fantasy had played out and they'd not won the local services. So it's mind-boggling and seems truly crazy, but it's just one of a number of similarly bizarre things that happened while I was working in the detention system. So of course the date came and went, and nothing happened. but it really illustrates to me the two underlying principles of immigration detention: the absolute priority of secrecy above all, and the conception of asylum seekers as dangerous, inhuman and deceitful people. This is a necessary view, though, to justify their poor treatment, an example of the psychological mechanism which we call projection. That is, attributing your own feelings and motivations that you don't want to admit to others. Meanwhile, further policy changes are underway. The political crisis of continuing arrival of people seeking asylum led first to the rapid turnarounds policy, in which people were denied the opportunity to make an asylum claim and screened out of processing to be returned. Presumably to aid in this process, this included instructions from the Immigration Department that health staff should not ask people about torture and trauma as part of their health screening assessment. Of course, when rapid turnarounds proved ineffective as a deterrent, the then Labor government turned to offshore detention. Deemed necessary as an increased level of deterrence to asylum seekers and justified by saving lives at sea or no deaths on our doorstep argument. Both these policies co-opted health professionals to breach ethical obligations by handing over asylum seeker personal health information to the Immigration Department without their informed consent, in order for the person to be returned or sent to an offshore facility. Both these policies demanded that health professionals displace their ethical obligation to their individual patient in favour of the government's policy objectives. Opaque procedures, lack of information given to asylum seekers, obvious fictions such as pretending that the Nauruan and PNG governments were in charge of the centres and that asylum seekers were not being detained by calling them transferees and not detainees, created an immediate environment of mistrust and unrest in the offshore centres. These centres were by their design and intent far more punitive and harmful places than even the harshest detention centres in Australia. The negative health effects on asylum seekers were immediately apparent from our mental health monitoring, showing that the people sent offshore fared much worse and their mental health deteriorated much more quickly than those who had remained in Australia. These facts led to increasing conflict with the department, especially when psychiatric hospital treatment was required. This was partly due to the amount of work and the costs and logistics, but most of all it was the politics of moving people from Manus or Nauru to Australia for treatment. We were expressly told by the Immigration Department that movement to Australia for medical reasons was to be avoided because it undermined the government's policy that people detained offshore would never come to Australia. Furthermore, it opened up the possibility that asylum seekers could gain access to lawyers, and it was important for the government to deny them legal representation. The introduction of offshore detention also saw the progressive and systematic dismantling of the positive immigration health policies that had been put in place after the Palmer report. When the offshore centres were opened, the independent advisory group was excluded from involvement. At the same time, the group's terms of reference were changed, diluting its focus on asylum seekers in detention, and its representative membership was cut. The group's independent chair was ousted, replaced by the government's hand-picked health advisor, a former military doctor with close links to senior departmental officials. Further meetings of the advisory group were cancelled, and finally the independent group was disbanded altogether, leaving only the department's own trusted man, who was then able to choose his own unrepresentative panel of advisors. With the independent advisory group out of the way and compliant advice from its hand-picked advisors assured, the Immigration Department was in an unopposed position to demand cuts to health staffing and the removal of interpretation and commentary from health reporting. When confronted with mental health statistics that did not support its position, it simply axed the most important elements of the mental health screening procedures. At this point, one of the few remaining mechanisms of independent oversight was the Australian Human Rights Commission inquiry into children in detention. Although Immigration Department officials had instructed health staff to avoid being helpful to the Commission and said anyone making anonymous submissions would be discovered and punished, they were not successful in thwarting the inquiry. In hearings of the inquiry, the previous and the then current minister were subject to detailed forensic examination, the former painfully trying to avoid responsibility in the latter, who went on the attack. Despite these attacks, the inquiry, through the Commission's own investigations by its capacity to compel the Immigration Department to release information, produced a landmark, powerful and damning report that meticulously documented the abuses and harms of prolonged detention on the mental health of children and families. This episode marked the end of my involvement with the system, as it was clear to me that dissent or disagreement within was not tolerated and independent oversight was not allowed. The beneficial changes that have been put in place have been unravelled, and the system had returned to the position before the Palmer reforms. I believe that it was no longer possible to continue to work within the system without contributing to further harm. Since then, the Border Force Act came into being with bipartisan support, further extending secrecy surrounding the immigration detention system. Staff reporting in abuses in Nauru have been persecuted, and there have been a number of tragedies, including self-immolations and the deaths of Hamid Karzai and others in detention due to poor medical care. Australia's policies have been condemned by the United Nations, multiple international humanitarian organisations, and the PNG Court has found the detention of asylum seekers in Manus Island is illegal. Men, women and children continue to be forced to suffer misery, to drain them of hope, and as a warning to others. This is not an Australia that we can be proud of. We cannot support policies that defy international law. We cannot support governments that attack the institutions of civil society, governments that enact laws that keep us in the dark and seek to silence dissent. If we're to be free, we cannot continue to arbitrarily imprison and punish asylum seekers who have come to us seeking their own freedom. Thank you.